Okay, looks like Dave's got his sound linked up. All right, so it is 5:30. We've got a pretty good quorum, so we'll go ahead and get started. Just a couple quick reminders. We are recording, and this meeting is being live streamed via Boxcast for anybody who's interested in watching it, and then the recording will be available afterwards on YouTube. And then just please use the raise hand function. It's in the reactions tab at the bottom, and just put the raise hands, and I'll try to get to everybody as we go along. And with that, we are going to start on, oh yes, Dolly, please.
Can you put on the chat for a brief moment, like the link for the live stream?
Why don't we send that out via an email? Jesse,
well, because I mean, if I know there are people who might be interested like right now, but I said, well, I don't know how to include them in, and I thought I'd put it on the CCE Facebook page.
Yeah, absolutely. Jesse can email you that link right now.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, we are not able to use the chat because it's public meeting law.
Oh, I see. Okay. I get it.
That's why we have that turned off.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll get that email, that link to you right now. All right, and with that, we will start on high capacity transit. So we're going to start with Shelby's going to do a brief introduction, and then we have Dave Roth here as our subject matter expert from Tigard, who's going to speak a little bit, and then we'll go into our discussion. So Shelby, please.
All right. So the essential question that I want everybody to be thinking about when we go over this is, does this belong in Tigard's charter? So kind of some of the history and the information that you have received in your packets. So this measure, as we've discussed before, was put in the charter by initiative, and is very difficult, complicated, hard to understand, and hard to interpret. And so when it was passed, the city's response was to figure out what does it mean and how do we comply with it. And so what we came up with was, under Oregon law, we talked a little bit about home rule in the beginning. Under Oregon law, if a charter needs interpreting, it is first up to the city council to interpret its own charter, unless it's a matter clearly reserved for a circuit court or other court. And so in this case, we decided, okay, so we can interpret our own charter. That will give us an idea of whether somebody is going to challenge our interpretation. So that would be our first kind of bite at the apple, is, are we going to elicit a challenge to our interpretation? Then we will apply our interpretation, and that will be sent to the voters, because we knew that we had to make land use changes in order to do what we needed to do with the planning. So that was Ordinance 1611, was interpreting the charter, because there are things like capacity of roads. So what does capacity mean? Is capacity lane miles? Is it vehicle trips? Is it vehicle miles? Is it just the footprint of the road? What does it actually mean? And so I think the section of charter, when you read it, it seems like it makes sense. Capacity, okay. And then you actually dig deeper and think, okay, no, what is capacity really? So it uses words that everybody understands, but very difficult to apply in this context. So that was the point of 1611, was let's interpret it, let's get the framework spelled out, and then we can go from there in terms of the application. So then 1612 was the actual application. So that's where we had the engineer come in and say, okay, so you interpreted road capacity like this. Well, this is what that looks like in actual numbers. So we defined the charter language, we interpreted and applied the charter language, and then we referred it to the ballot. And so that you have the measure statement, the SEL that goes into the voters pamphlet, and the resolution of council. So that was the city's process. It passed at the ballot by the skin of its teeth. It was a very close vote. So then from there, So that authorized a certain measure of support for this project, not a lot, but some. So then in terms of the implications of it, what happened next, the application. So then with a large land use project like this, which light rail is, it spans multiple jurisdictions. And so it is very difficult for an applicant, in this case, TriMet, to work through each individual city's land use processes along the way. And so there's a thing called a land use final order, a LUFO, that is basically the state legislature steps in and it's a kind of supersiding. And so it says, this is the application, these are the rules that apply. So Tigard was really concerned in this process too, because we had a charter provision that said what applies. And so we specifically asked the state legislature in our case to preempt the city's charter requirement. And so this was something that, going back to home rule, we were loath to do because we don't want to give up home rule authority. And we never want to cede that the legislature has the ability to preempt a city's charter on something that is so intrinsically applicable to city governance, like its own land use and development processes. So we did ask the legislature for it. They did apply, they did pass the legislation, the LUFO was approved. And so we actually did have that in state statute then that said that basically Tigard's charter provision was preempted to the extent it conflicted with the LUFO order. So that was kind of the tortured past of how this was applied. So I don't want to get into the substance of it yet, but just kind of procedurally, that's what it looked like. So I do want to, so I want John and Jason to give their perspectives on it also. But first I want Dave Roth, who's our senior transportation planner, to weigh in just a little bit about kind of the practical implications of what this language currently means for transportation planning and projects in Tigard.
Thanks, Shelby, and hello, committee members. Thank you very much for your service here. I know this is a big task, and it's requiring a lot of time and thought from you, so thank you. Shelby, you zoomed right in on the issue to begin with, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a big step back and kind of talk about transportation planning generally at the city of Tigard, and then bring it back to that micro level again. So I have a presentation that I'll run through quickly, and I hope that this provides a bit more context just for the transportation planning and policy realm within Tigard. So Kim, if you could go to the next slide. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what sets our transportation policies and policy guidance for the city. So starting off with, we have a Tigard strategic plan with a strategic vision that suggests that Tigard is an equitable community that's walkable, healthy, and accessible for everyone. Next slide, please. We have a complete streets policy that was adopted in June of 2019, a couple of years before the new strategic vision. And the complete streets policy, as adopted by City Council, suggests that our transportation system should serve all users equitably, regardless of how they get around. Next slide. Those two policy documents, the strategic vision, strategic plan, and our complete streets policy, were foundational to the update of our transportation system plan, or our TSP. Our TSP is a state mandated transportation plan that sets out our transportation goals and policies, as well as our planned projects for a specific time horizon. In this case, with the update that was completed in January of 22, it's a 20-year, essentially, time horizon. It goes out to 2040. The key elements of our TSP are completing our streets to serve everyone, breaking down barriers such as Highway 217 or the railway, continuing to invest in our off-street trail network, addressing bottlenecks and circulation problems across the city, and also partnering on regional mobility solutions. Next slide. The TSP has a set of vision and goals. Oh, and by the way, I'm happy to answer any questions if we have any along the way. I can't see anybody right now. Our TSP vision is Tigard's transportation system advances our strategic vision to be an equitable community that's accessible, walkable, and healthy for everyone. These 6 goals here discuss things like safety and comfort, neighborhood livability, economic development, efficient use of transportation resources, and so on and so forth. And so I think you're probably picking up on a theme here. There's a lot of consistency across our policy documents, and then especially our TSP. I just want to go back to something that Shelby said at the kickoff of the meeting tonight, and that is, in interpreting the charter language, section 53, really what it boiled down to was measuring roadway capacity in terms of vehicular throughput. And I just want to draw to your attention that that's a bit inconsistent with our policy guidance in other areas, such as our transportation system plan, which take a more holistic approach to thinking about our transportation system. Next slide. I have a few slides here on climate, and this is obviously a really important topic, not just for our city, but statewide, nationally, globally. We, as part of the transportation system plan, we had the consultant team support us by providing a greenhouse gas reduction memo. And what that did was it acknowledged and highlighted actions that we're already taking to try to reduce the impact of our transportation system on greenhouse gases. And then it also recommended some additional actions, such as more partner coordination with TriMet to enhance transit services in the city. And it had a number of Tigard specific actions that we could take, some around vehicle electrification. Next slide. Oh, here we go. Tigard specific actions. So commute trip reductions. In other words, transportation demand management tools, rideshare programs, subsidized or discounted transit programs, employer van pools, priced parking, EV charging infrastructure, and then again, priced public parking. Next slide. So that'd be interesting just to share with you some information here. This is data from our most recent Oregon Household Activity Survey. And what this is telling us is in the Portland metro region, the mean number of trips a person takes in the Portland metro region are 8.8 trips per day. The mean distance traveled is 56 miles per day. And the mean amount of travel time per day is 175 minutes. So people are traveling a lot in this region. The graphic here shows sort of the inflow and outflow of those travel patterns across the region. Next slide. This one is specific to Tigard, and what it's showing, I have 2 different pieces of information here. On the graphic, it's showing how many people are, on the left side, employed in Tigard, but they live outside of the city. In the center, the number of people that are employed and live both in Tigard. And then on the right-hand side, the number of people that live in Tigard and work outside. And as you can see, a very small proportion of our population actually live and work in Tigard. And so, people are moving in and out of the city a lot, and they're doing that primarily by auto-based trips. And the table on the left-hand side shows data, both the most current data from the model that we used for the TSP, as well as projected mode splits if we implement our projects and policies in the TSP. So I think the highlight here is the way that we have our transportation system, as well as our land use patterns, are are set up, the built environment that we find ourselves in, most people are driving for those trips. And this is important as we get into some of the climate related slides here. So next slide. So transportation and climate. So in Oregon, 40% of overall greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector. The majority of these emissions are directly from cars and light trucks. So last slide highlighted, how people are moving about, where they live versus where they work in relation to Tigard. And, we just know that those trips are generating a lot of greenhouse gas emissions today. Next slide. I probably don't need to go into too much detail here. This is just an illustration of historic temperature patterns versus the last, highlighting in on the last 200 years. And we know that temperatures are increasing, and it's clearly linked to human activity. Next slide. Some of you may have seen this article that came out in the New York Times about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And the article was basically suggesting that the Portland region was doing pretty well in terms of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions from some sectors. So commercial, residential, and industrial are trending down. But transportation has been fairly flat over the past 3 decades. Next slide. I think some of you probably are aware that the city conducted a climate resiliency plan work last year, and that resulted in a climate action report that went in front of council, I believe it was last fall. And that documented our baseline carbon emissions for the city. It shared with us where our carbon emissions are going in a business as usual scenario. So if the city does not take any actions, and they are being reduced because of state mandates. But it also included a number of low carbon actions. And I just am highlighting the 5 transportation or mobility related low carbon actions. And so you see here, to address the, aside from the built environment, aside from changing our land use patterns, which we're also working on, the transportation related actions that we can take involve increasing our active and transit mode share. So trying to bring that up to 20%, whereas it's less than 10% today. That could result in a reduction in the greenhouse gases by about 3%. Electrifying the public transit fleet, you have a very small reduction there in greenhouse gases. Electrifying our municipal vehicle fleet and equipment, slightly more significant reduction. Electrifying personal and light duty commercial vehicles, fairly significant reduction. So a lot of work happening in that space right now. And then ensuring that at least 10% of our medium and heavy duty vehicles are electric. That could result in a 7% reduction. So just to highlight here, transit and active mode shares are important. 3% is significant when we're talking about all of the different sectors that we need to address for reducing climate impacts. Next slide. So high capacity transit and the Tigard City Charter. Shelby did a great job of introducing the topic tonight, and I imagine that you've all done a bit of reading beforehand in advance of the meeting. So I probably don't need to go into too much detail here, but in the charter we have section 52 and 53. 52 discusses no tax increases without a public vote, and of course this one is expired. It expired in December of last year. And then section 53, which Shelby discussed, has some language around opposing construction of a new high capacity transit corridor. And then the discussion around reducing road capacity, and Shelby highlighted the difficulty in translating exactly what that means. And it includes roadway capacity within 5 miles of the city. Finally, would require a public vote describing the impacts of transit on or high capacity transit on those elements. And it requires an annual letter that the city is supposed to write to multiple different agencies saying that we oppose high capacity transit. I'll just stop there and just say, based off of the policy guidance that we have from our strategic plan, our complete streets policy, our transportation system plan, we'll just say this is completely inconsistent with existing adopted policy. And I'll leave it at that. Next slide. And then just really briefly, I only have one slide here. So how is roadway capacity measured? There's a number of different ways that you can do this, number of different scales that we would be talking about, different types of tools that you would use. In terms of scale, it could be at the network scale, it could be individual roadway segments, or even down to the intersection level. Tools that have been used in the past and are continued to be used today are level of service and volume to capacity ratio. So these are really related to delay and ability to move vehicles through either roadway segments or intersections. Limitations to measuring roadway capacity. Well, it's 100% auto-focused. I think Shelby brought that up. And the city worked to interpret what the rules were. And the interpretation was really 100% autofocus. So you're unable to think a little bit more critically about how, for example, if you had a dedicated transit lane, how many people you could move in a bus versus cars in the flow of traffic. So it really limits the type of analysis that we can do. And then finally, as I mentioned before, it's just not aligned with local or regional mobility policy. I think it's important to call out that the whole region is moving forward with some new thinking around mobility policy, and that's housed in the regional transportation plan owned and managed by Metro, of which all of the agencies in the region are participant in. Really a shift going towards person trips versus vehicle trips. So you're counting how many people and how efficiently and reliably you can move people through the transportation network rather than solely focusing on cars. So I think that's my last slide. With that, I'll stop and happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
All right, I don't see any hands for questions, but oh, there we go. Jeanette, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dave, for that very helpful overview and discussion. And my understanding is, and I believe it did come up in council too, was that the climate resiliency plan, as well as the Tigard job inflow and outflow, were based on pre-COVID analysis. So it didn't take into account how many folks are now working at home. So just a bit of context, not that it would change a lot, some of the numbers, but I know that was a discussion point. And is that accurate?
Yeah, I think, well, the TSP and the climate resiliency plan were occurring during COVID, but they relied on pre-COVID data. I will say that the regional transportation plan, which is kind of the equivalent of our own transportation system plan, is doing some really interesting research right now on the COVID impacts on work from home and how that's impacting people's travel. It is getting incorporated into the regional transportation plan right now. And they're looking at a bunch of different scenarios, but there definitely has been an impact. The trip peaks have changed a lot. So travel has sort of flattened across the day. So you have less peaking during, what used to be morning and evening rush hour times. But there's still, the overall travel has not decreased that much since pre-COVID. It's just been spread out more.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And Kim, since the chat function is not working, I have to leave at 6:30 because I am the liaison to the Parks and Rec committee. So in case you see me disappear, that is why. We just had a juggling conflict.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that gives some really helpful context around the transportation and our planning, but I'd love to hear more about the context behind kind of the politics and how this charter amendment came to be. So I'm going to start with Jason, if you don't mind being called on to offer some of that context.
Yeah, John and I both, we agreed I'd go first, so that was good. You figured that out naturally. So I guess I want to start by saying, I mean, I'm going to say a lot of political things here, not like DNR kinds of politics. I'm not even part of a party, but like the politics of this stuff. And so I want to just say that at the outset. And I'm curious if John ends up agreeing with this, but I would say my ultimate conclusion, he and I both lived through the entire set of essentially all of the measures and all of the politics and the project that was supposed to be the Southwest Corridor high capacity transit. So this is all stuff he and I literally lived through. And I would say that ultimately, I think my conclusion, and frankly, the people that planned some of the measures that ended up in our charter, they had a singular purpose, and that was to really actually stop the project from happening. They're not allowed to write a measure that says that, but that was the purpose in sort of putting the language that was on the ballot in various forms. That was the purpose in doing a lot of this. And I think John will end up saying he agrees with that. But that's really what they were hoping. What it said oftentimes was the public should have a vote, they should have a voice. It shouldn't be the council or some other form of government that's sort of shoving it down people's throats. What I think was hard being trying to, part of the responsibility of the city council and the city as a whole is to plan for the future. And a lot of this was really a desire for us to just sort of stick our head in the sand and pretend like no one's going to move here and we have no need to plan for the future, or planning for the future is bad, to be honest. Like we don't want to do that, because that might mean that we have the infrastructure here. The reality is people are going to be moving to our region no matter what. And so we really have an obligation and a need to plan. The other thing I would point out is that for me personally, I think, and some of you have heard me say this before, I viewed my role as an elected official that one of my main jobs was to advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves very effectively. And the reason I raised that is this is an example for me. Transportation, and particularly public transportation and high capacity transit, is a major equity issue. The people that need it the most are frequently least able to advocate effectively for themselves, or in a poor position to do so. And that meant that I felt like even if I didn't need to personally use this much or a lot, that it was still an obligation and something that we needed to do. I will also say that it was very awkward to have things in the charter that said, for example, the mayor will send a letter to everybody, including the Federal Transit Administration, saying that we actively oppose the project, even when the people signing the letter didn't agree with that. I know John had to deal with that actually more than me. But that was the kind of stuff that ended up in the charter. And, the reason it ended up there is because that's, I think, the only place really, and the only way that the groups that were concerned about and really wanting to shut the project down had an avenue in Tigard to help make that happen. The project, as it was conceived at the time, couldn't happen without Tigard's participation. And so I think that's partly why Tigard was sort of targeted for that. John, what do you have to add? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
First of all, I agree with everything Jason said, so I won't contradict or disagree with anything. Dave, can you put back up the slide, your second to last slide, the one with section 52 and 53 on it, please? Section 52, even though you said it's expired, the thing with that one, though, is in that one, they basically, the first of all, let's go back. These are voter initiative. In other words, as we talked on other items before, the council didn't get to sit down and have our attorney help us write this. We didn't get to wordsmith it. We didn't get to do anything. So, these words were put in by somebody else that wrote it up. And like Jason said, it was basically to stop the project. So section 52 only talks about light rail. I'm actually okay with that from the standpoint of during the last 10 years, we wouldn't have had to do this anyway. And so everybody was worried that Tigard was going to have to come up with millions of dollars. After the fact, Milwaukee had to come up with millions. How did they have to pay for things after the fact on the Orange Line and things like that? The way we had our deal structured is Washington County was going to pay all the local matches. So Tigard wasn't going to have to kick in millions of dollars to do this. Therefore, we weren't going to raise fees to do this. We were going to use the county's money to do that. And then the whole region would have to vote on a package, and therefore everybody would have a say in that aspect of it. But Tigard itself was never going to actually kick in millions of dollars. And so I was never really over worried about section 52. Now, section 53 is a whole different ball of wax. So the fact that, section A says that the city of Tigard, as a matter of public policy, opposes construction of new high capacity transit corridor within city boundary unless voter approvals are first obtained. The fact that this one just says high capacity transit. So you mainly hear in high capacity transit, there is light rail and there's bus rapid transit. So from that standpoint, there's LRT and BRT, as we like to use acronyms, but high capacity transit includes both of them. This one here just opposes everything. And so from that standpoint, that was very difficult because there were even some of the people that voted against it or didn't want it still wanted buses or bus rapid transit. This sort of, squashed that one also. So I think people didn't really understand the wording difference between 52 and 53. The other thing is the 5 miles, the problem with that is the group was concerned that, okay, in Barber Boulevard, they're going to do a road diet. And basically, maybe in areas where it has 4 lanes, they're going to go down to 2 lanes of cars and 2 lanes of light rail. Well, we can't control Barber Boulevard. It's not in our city or anything else. So to actually have in our charter that we have to oppose something that happens 5 miles from us, even if they don't even build it in Tigard, is an issue. And so we all had problems with that. It's section D. Every year the city shall write a letter notifying public. That was very difficult. It was difficult in multiple ways. Number one is every time I went into a metro meeting to talk, I was on the committee for Southwest Corridor, and every time I went into a meeting, I felt like I was wearing a hat, and the hat said, I oppose high capacity transit. So, whenever I actually would have to state that when I spoke before the Metro Council, before I spoke. And so everything I did, I had to write a letter to them once a year. I had to state it before I talked at any meeting. And therefore, it was very difficult. Imagine going into a room and asking them for a grant for a sidewalk project. At the same time, I have to say, I'm against high capacity transit. Those people giving it away aren't really feeling very comfy and all fuzzy and warm about that because you just said you're against what they're about. And I'm not saying if I'm for or against it, the fact that I had to state that and write a letter once a year was terrible. So the fact that we had to write a letter to the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, then I'd go back to DC and lobby for transportation dollars. It's just counterintuitive. It just never made sense. So the fact is, the other fact that isn't really talked about was whether Tigard said yes or no, TriMet could have built this anyway. It didn't have to go for a vote of the people. We actually were able to change some of those land use ordinances before this was enacted. And we didn't do it because of this. We did it because it was what Tigard needed. It wasn't because of high capacity transit. So we got those changed even before this initiative. And then TriMet could have built it anyway. They have a super siding ability that they can come and build it through your city, whether you want to or not. it doesn't matter what the road capacity is happening in Portland or on Barbara or somewhere else. They can come through and build it. And that's the aspect of having this in here. It really gives a foregone conclusion that everybody thinks, okay, Tigard's against everything like this. And maybe all the citizens aren't, but 50.7% were at the time, or maybe they were just confused enough and felt that it would just cost millions of dollars that they would have to bore in the package of that. So, the hardest thing was wearing the hat, writing the letters, and telling everybody that we were against it, even though we couldn't have stopped it if they wanted to build it anyway. If it passed, it was going to be built. Thanks, Dave.
The other part to that, just to do a quick circle back from what John just said, is that in the reality of these things is we can shoot, if we just kept opposing it, let's say we just kept doing that, what would end up happening if the project got built is we would get, as a city, none of the things that we needed or wanted, because we completely lose our advocacy position and our ability to, bargain's probably the wrong word, but influence the things that matter to us as a community. And so that's the kind of stuff you lose with this, is just a huge amount of influence.
Thank you both for that context. Based on that, 52 has expired, but are you recommending that the committee remove section 53?
I've told Jason this before. I would actually like to hear from everybody else and their comments before Jason and me tell you our opinion. You can read between the lines if you want, but I have a comment when we get to the end, but I would prefer to hear everybody else before Jason may make that comment, Kim.
All right, thanks, John. Karen, please.
As a voter, I kind of wanted to add a little more political context, because I do think people thought that they were voting no to allowing TriMet or the light rail to come down Barbara Boulevard and 99, whatever you want to call it, Pacific Highway into Tigard, and that we were going to lose a lane each direction, and that therefore traffic was going to be a nightmare, in addition to, oh my gosh, we don't want to pay for that. Obviously that isn't what we were voting yes or no on, but that is what kind of got out there, that we thought, I'll say we, I not me, but we thought we were saying no to that iteration of the project. And the fact that it's now lingered past into other projects and affected other projects is definitely unfortunate. But so I can just say right now, I'm in favor of getting rid of section 53.
Thank you, Karen. Margaret, please.
I think I have a question first before I have an opinion. As I recall, when these measures were on the ballot, what was the vote count on these? It seems to me that there wasn't much of a difference between the yeses and the nos.
They were pretty close. Let me look that up first.
Like 100 and some votes.
Yeah, I'll look that up.
Yeah. And so that was it, because, looking at it, if it was on the information that you sent out on the SEL 802, I wasn't quite sure whether that was it, but I think it was a very, very close vote. It's something that is, I think, a little archaic. And I also don't like the message that it's that in 53, the message that it sends to our neighbors who we're trying to work with on solving issues for the future. So even without the vote count, which I remember was very, very close, I think I would be a yes on getting rid of it, not renewing it.
Thank you, Margaret. And I'm looking that up right now. Nathan, please.
So I'm struggling to separate my fairly strong policy positions on what was previously passed from the charter question on this, but just to give a sense of kind of where I am with this, two of the first things I wrote down as I was taking notes, I take a lot of notes when I'm doing this kind of thing. I wrote bad faith and underlined it several times. And I wrote policy outcome masquerading as citizen oversight. So I think a lot of that was coming through in what the former mayor's already said, but and that's kind of how I felt at the time, even of the vote, was it felt like the people proposing it were trying to accomplish something other than what they said they were trying to accomplish. And the other aspect of it for me anyway is I guess I just find that the way the language is written just kind of embarrassing to have in our charter, regardless of the policy implications. Just the language itself is kind of embarrassing. So I'm very in favor of not having that in the charter.
Thank you, Nathan. And so there were two charter amendments. One was for 52, and that one was the vote to use funds for light rail construction. It passed pretty handedly, 18,000 to 3,800. But like John said, that one also didn't have as much sense behind it. And then the second charter amendment proposal that was adopt Tigard policy opposing new high capacity transit corridor projects passed very narrowly, 5,094 to 4,864. And notice that total votes is very low, and that this is worth noting was done in a March election. So not exactly known for getting the voters out. So thank you, Margaret, for asking those questions. And Carol, please.
Yeah, one thing that people should know is that these were brought in by outsiders. They were able to round up some Tigard people to actually, file paperwork and stuff. But outsiders came in. There was a lot of bad information. Karen and Margaret are both right. Some stuff got out about splitting our town in two, striking it down 99, even though our electeds were very clear that they would never let that happen. And then, the thing that really bothered me is one of the biggest complaints people have, the community complains about, is traffic. And this would have helped. It didn't mean that everyone had to get on light rail or on a rapid bus, but their traffic experience would be better if they would let other people do this. And it just seems so, disingenuous.
Thank you, Carol. And Lindsay, please.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of funny. It almost feels like this is a fluke thing that happened. It narrowly passed. Out of all the areas that were going to be subject to this change, only Tigard, and we're reviewing the other charters, has this specifically in the charter. And so somehow it was just people in the right place at the right time convinced enough people. So I think if this was a larger, more problematic issue that communities were facing, we would see it come up in other charters as we've kind of looked at other issues and looking at comparable language. Because we are so small, we are in a metro area, we're not, in isolation affected by this issue by ourselves. So I think that's the most compelling part for me, is that this doesn't show up in anyone else's charter. It just kind of somehow got through on Tigard. So I'm happy to support removing it.
Thank you, Lindsay. And so Carol, did you have another comment, or is your hand just still up? No, okay. And then Nathan, please.
Well, I actually had a question, and it can wait until after everyone else has given their opinion, but the question is basically just if this was the only route open to the people opposed to light rail coming to Tigard, is there something we need to consider to give them another avenue so that that's not the approach they take next time for something like this?
Definitely a consideration. Thank you, Nathan. And Tony, please.
Can you hear me okay? I apologize. I'm using completely different equipment. I had a technical issue, so I apologize for my late arrival. I do, I'm definitely in favor of keeping 52. I like people getting to have their voice. And I'm hearing what the mayors were saying about different communities. And I also am also in favor of people having a voice for that too, because I understand what people are pointing to other communities not having this language in their charters. But my concern is what's good for the community to our north and the community to our south, and the shortest distance between 2 points to connect their mass transit may not be the most favorable for Tigard. So I've seen instances in places where I've moved from where they've made some massive traffic changes where old towns that were really dependent on the traffic that was coming through them were basically bulldozed and ran over, or the road system went completely over and no one had any traffic to their businesses anymore, and they just completely disappeared. And that was a kind of a loss of the culture and the sense of that community. And it was kind of replaced by crime. That wasn't really an ideal alternative. But I'm also mindful of, we have a lot of natural areas, and we could end up with groups that, we're looking at, do we want to go through a natural area that exists that's beautiful, and we don't want to, disrupt it. I mean, I have deer coming through my neighborhood on a regular basis, a herd of deer, and I really don't want to see their forest bulldozed because it's the most efficient way. So I'd like to have a voice. I'd like to be able to vote when it comes down to that. Is it going to be a community of color that has the mass transit line for them, or is it going to be a natural area? Is it going to be, who gets bulldozed? Because somebody has to, for mass transit to come through, you're balancing it for your community, and I think that we should have a vote for that. But I am definitely in favor of removing the compelled language of asking our officials to make statements that they may not personally believe in. I think I'm opposed to that very, very strongly. But I'm also in favor of not, as a city, saying we oppose everything, because it was a close vote. So I don't think the entire city should be saying we oppose all mass transit. So I'm definitely on board. And if that's getting rid of all of 53, then I'm in favor of 52, but 53 has a lot of language in it that's very offensive.
So to clarify, 52 has expired. It did have a sunset date that has passed. So are you recommending that it be renewed?
Yes, I'm sorry, that is my recommendation for 52. And I think that also would address any concerns that might be if 53 is still in effect, if there's voter stuff in that, put it back in 52 and then stop telling the entire state that we oppose all mass transit, because I agree with the other people that have spoken, that I think that's not what our community values are.
Thank you, Tim. And Zena, please. Oh, you're muted.
Hi. So by listening everybody and reading about all the about the transit, I am definitely in favor of removing the 53.
Thank you, Zena. Anyone who hasn't shared your thoughts on this subject of removing or altering 52, 53? Yes, Jeanette, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely, with 52 expiring and 50 with the 53, I would recommend that we remove them. But I also would like to highly recommend that we revisit some of the transit, because times have changed. There are different mobility solutions. There are inflow outflow differentials. And so that's something that I know the transportation committee and advisory task force and the city council will look at, but that would be my comments. Thank you.
And you recommend that as a staff recommendation, not as a charter amendment?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Jason and John, looks like we've heard from all the folks who want to raise their voice at this moment. So I would love to entertain your thoughts. Whoever wants to go first.
I think when you're, I think Tony's comments, as I'm kind of reflecting on them, I think there's a general sort of feeling, I think, among many, that sort of people having choice and voting is just a good democratic sort of principle. I think when you get down to it, the challenges for those of us that have been doing this work is that oftentimes means that you have to know what it is you're going to vote on. You have to have, it's not as simple, the democratic principle is simple, which is you want people to have a voice and be able to vote on things. If I were to say, yes, Tony, I agree with that, just sort of in principle here, I then am faced with a huge set of questions right this moment about what parts of that would get voted on at what point in the phase of the work. Is it only on funding? Is it on the siting of the project? And many of these things are super fluid and are not like, you can just say that's exactly what's going to happen. And so it becomes, it actually, even though you may not want it to become an impediment, it actually becomes an impediment in practice to actually ever doing some of the things. So I guess that's just I want to acknowledge that I think that's generally, like, voting on things is generally a good democratic principle. When you get it into the weeds on some of these things, it becomes practically very difficult. And frankly, the reason why we have representative governments in the form of elected officials to some extent, because the complexity to understand, I think anyone's capable of understanding a lot of this, but it takes huge amounts of time to do so, and an investment both in time and in resources that many people just practically don't have, they can't. And I guess that's where I struggle with what to do given my urge towards those democratic principles.
Thank you, Jason. And Tony, please.
Sorry. I do have a question that's kind of related to 52. My understanding of that is it was primarily around the taxing, that if there was going to be any projects done, that there would need to be a vote if there was going to be an increase in any sort of taxes. So part of my question related to that, is there another mechanism within the charter or within state law or with city planning that there requires some sort of vote already for a tax increase that would be related to transportation? Is there any redundancy in this? I mean, to address we don't need to vote twice if there's already a mechanism for that, because that's kind of silly. So that's kind of answer or to relate to what Jason brought up.
John is jumping.
I'll let Shelby answer first, and then I'll comment.
So I'll give the lawyer answer of it depends. So in terms of property taxes, that those always have to be voted on. There is no ability of city council to unilaterally raise property taxes. That either has to be a bond or levy. So that's like the recent transportation measure that we all voted on, I guess 2 years ago, that would include more than that, I guess, that would include the Southwest corridor that Metro had on the measure. So that would have been a property tax increase. It was not Tigard's measure, but it was on the ballot and it was voted on by the entire region. So if Tigard, so property taxes are one thing. If Tigard wanted to do like Ashland has a restaurant tax, that can be unilaterally opposed by council. That's how City of Ashland did it. It can be referred. So we've talked about with enough signatures, it can be referred to the ballot and the public votes on it. All tax measures have to have a 30-day ordinance, so they can't be effective immediately. We have to allow time for signature gathering. So there are kind of niche taxes that council could impose. They're not going to be your big ticket items like a property tax, though, and those will always be before the voters.
So Shelby, that requirement, just so it's not a very high requirement, the number of signatures that would have to be brought forward, correct?
To refer, right, it's a really low bar.
It's a really low number. So it's not a lot of people that you could do something in 30 days, you could do something in a week, to get the number. It's not a high number. You don't have to get like 20% of the people or 10% of the people. It's a very, very low number to refer it. So from that standpoint, that's sort of why I agreed with Jason and a few others on one of the other items we were talking about before about voting, is because I agree. Sometimes you have to be nimble and be able to move quickly when you want to vote. And therefore, there is this way out that you can require a vote with a very limited number of signatures, not like 5, but it's pretty small. My point is, 52 never bothered me. The fact that it got in there and it passed by a whole bunch didn't matter because, like I said, we weren't planning on doing that. It doesn't mean that if 10 years from now, there won't be something different. So, but the fact that 52 expired, would I put it back in again? Like Jason said, the people that brought this forward wanted that to die. So that died. They weren't worried about 10 years from then. They just wanted, it currently to die at that point in time. So if 52, if it stayed, like I said, it really wouldn't bother me other than the fact that, it's only for light rail. We could still do bus rapid transit or something else, but there are a few other words in there that, if we want to keep part of 52, that I could live with part of it. But at the same time, I wouldn't want it word for word. If we keep anything for 52 or 53, they need to be wordsmith. And, Shelby would need to rewrite something and propose it and move it forward. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of that. I'm saying if anybody wants to move anything forward, it's not going to come out of these words. Maybe it has the same meaning, but these words just are not what we need to do. As for 53, I was always opposed to it. I was opposed to it the whole time during the campaigns. I was opposed to it every time I had to state it. At the same time, the fact that TriMet could build it anyway, to us have a vote about that really doesn't help. And the reason they never went to Tualatin, they figured if they could kill it in Tigard, they didn't need to go to Tualatin to do this. So once they passed it in Tigard, they didn't actually have to bring this to Tualatin. So it was proposed to take it to them also, but you only have to stop partway through is what they felt, but it could be built anyway. If they want to build it down 99W, ODOT owns the road and TriMet has authority to do anything. So they could do it if they wanted. The fact that Jason said is we would have something that we could say or negotiate or bargain with. I think that's a lot more important along the way of getting what we want than it is to try and say we oppose everything. So I'm against 53. I could live with maybe a word or two of it and maybe part of 52 because Tony, you're right. They could add a fee. We have a park fee. We could add a transportation fee. And maybe it's to fill potholes, but maybe it's to build light rail. And that's the thing is somebody could always add something. So, it wouldn't, if 9 out of 11 of you felt that was important, it wouldn't be something I'm going to die on the sword on. So it's the kind of thing is what I really don't want is to leave the words the way they are. And my biggest worry of this whole thing is, and Jason, Carol's correct. The people that brought this forward, actually, most of them lived out of town. And so they were from Vancouver. They were from,
Wilsonville.
Wilsonville. They were, we're talking past, Yamhill and stuff. I mean, they were not people from Tigard. So yes, they got a few people from Tigard to sign their name and do that. And they got enough voters to do that. So, but the money didn't come that paid for it from Tigard, that paid for the election against it or for it. And so everything about it was just people outside the area trying to push it through. My biggest worry would be if we throw this out, will that cause a group of people in Tigard that really don't want light rail? Will it cause them to come out against this new charter proposal? And that's a political question I have. And so you're talking politics. So my worry is, like we threw out the Willamette River water, I'm fine with that. Those people, that was 20, 30 years ago. This is in the last 10 years. And so from that standpoint, these people are still around. There's, there aren't 8 or 10 other communities now that are drinking the water that are, now doing this. So it's the kind of thing is my worry is, will this cause a group of people to come out and go against this? I'd like to throw them both out if you want my opinion, but I'm letting you know my worry politically that it could bring forward.
Thank you, John. So based on the discussion I've heard so far, there's really two kind of core recommendations that are out on the table right now, as well as some concerns that are on the table. So one being remove 52 and 53. 52 is expired, don't renew it, and then remove 53 entirely. Second recommendation being to renew 52 and keep it intact, and then to remove 53. And then there's still this lingering consideration around the political nature of 53 and what it represented and the folks that it represented. And Tony, please.
I just wanted to add a little bit of my context since you brought up the people that were in opposition to it, because I am one of those people. So I didn't really, I didn't write this. So I'm totally in favor of all of the rewording, but I was never not in favor of light rail or any sort of mass transit. When I was looking at the plans, I didn't like the path. It was the way that the place that they were proposing to put it, I didn't like it. That was it. That was my whole opposition. And that's really my whole desire to have something 52, something 53 in, is to give people a voice on where it goes, what the path is and how it's funded. Because to me, that's where the voice is, that's where the important part is, because, if somebody's going to put something that you're not going to use in a place you're not going to go, why do you care? I mean, it's not that big of a deal. Obviously people care about everything, but to me, that's just kind of my position on that. Is I didn't like where they were going to put it, and that was the whole sum total of my opposition to this. So I'm sorry it was so poorly worded. I wasn't aware of that when I was voting on it.
Thank you, Tony. And then Jason, did you have a response directly to that comment?
Yeah, I would say to Tony, there's just honestly much, and this is not directed at you, but just anybody that had that feedback in general, there's much better ways to get the route changed or get it servicing a different space. And that's much further up in the sort of engagement process and the design of the project. By the time something would be being voted on, it would be really late for that to affect change, other than to just, again, kill the project. So that could mean that we needed to have better outreach and better community involvement. But I would say voting at the tail end of something like that, where what you really want is a change in the route and what it's servicing, is just late in that process.
Thank you, Jason. And Shelby?
Yeah, so I do just want to make sure that we have realistic expectations about what the public vote can or cannot do. Because when I mentioned the LUFO earlier, that it's a super siting authority, that means that literally Tigard loses the ability to control the route. And so we had numerous conversations with TriMet, trying at all levels, Jason included, trying to get them to relocate the downtown station. And their response to us was, man, sorry, not a chance. It doesn't serve our needs. So sorry, Tigard. And those were daily, weekly, monthly conversations that we had. And so not anything pro or con on the vote, but just to establish realistic expectations about what the vote can and cannot do, and what the city of Tigard can and cannot do as a participant in this process. That we really, as soon as the state legislature passes the LUFO, the super siting land use final order, it gives all the cards to TriMet, and we're left with what we get.
Thank you for that context, Shelby. And Derek, thank you for waiting.
Just after carefully, listening, I appreciate all the context everyone's provided. My only thought on this is, to John's point, talking about maybe salvaging some section of 52 with taxes, right? I mean, I'm not really in favor of taxes just as a general rule as it is, but I certainly recognize, paying for things that we value, right? And we have a park fee and we have beautiful parks as a result of it. So I don't really mind paying for things that we all generally like. And mass transit is one that I can really see that if we, as a general policy, just don't approve it and we let everyone know, like I'm I'm receptive to what Jason said, which is, and I think John echoed it, is we lose our opportunity to have a good conversation with our neighbors and to try to affect that process. And that seems arrogant. So the idea of having that within our charter just seems like it, and also to Dave, who brought up some really good slides, right? We have several policy positions already on how it is that we're going to improve transit around our city. We can't really speak out of one side of our mouth and say this on the other side, right? It seems incongruent. So, my position would be to remove both of them. And to John's point, if some nefarious actors come out and try to do it again, hopefully this time we can speak to people like Tony, for example, right, who voted for something that he thought was right at the time, but maybe we can affect that policy a little bit better this time around and have that public messaging out there that needs to be out there so people don't get tricked. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Derek. And Jeanette, please.
And recognizing, John, your comment politically, I think you are probably spot on. There's a number of folks who could potentially vote against the charter if we don't include something. So I'm concerned about that because there's a lot of good work that's being done with this charter review committee. And not to create any additional work for Shelby, but is there something we could put in there that at least would put a nod towards like there wouldn't be necessarily a vote, but or at least something we could put in there just so folks can't use that as an excuse to vote against the charter review committee recommendations. Because the number one thing I hear all the time is whether it's going door to door, just being out, is folks don't want light rail. They're afraid of what's going to bring, like it did to Gresham. I mean, literally verbatim is what I hear all the time. It brought it to Gresham. It could bring it to Tigard. But so I'd hate for folks to just negate the charter work completely because of that. So just recognizing, John, your comments, I think that was key.
Yeah, I mean, we can keep the tax language because that is something that we have control over, is that Tigard we can make a pledge that we will not adopt any taxes without a vote. One wrinkle to that is that we'd have to figure out how regional measures fit into that. And so if the region votes on it, does Tigard require a separate vote? What happens if one passes, the other doesn't? How do those interact? So that would be one option, is to keep the tax requirement. Other than that, then we start getting into technologies and, methods of transportation. And in 10, 20, 30, 100 years, it's going to be an entirely different landscape. And so we're talking about trains now, and we could be talking about, spaceships in 100 years. So I really, from a charter standpoint, I really hesitate to build in something that we know is going to be antiquated in the not too distant future. So I guess I would kind of look to the group as to, aside from the vote on taxes, is there anything else that should be preserved in this language? And Jason's shaking his head no. Is there anything else that we should try to salvage? Or we can absolutely say Tigard won't adopt a new tax for this, but again, making sure that we know what the interplay is with a regional funding measure. Because Tigard won't build it alone is the other thing. We need a regional funding measure because these are so expensive. So it won't be Tigard on its own passing a tax.
All right, just to make sure this conversation kind of sees it through to the end. Derek, is your comment directly related to this conversation that just happened?
Yeah, just to make the comment that, no one has come to my door to ask me how I feel about public transportation, because I would have absolutely said that I'm in favor of it. Just as in general principle, I think that public transportation is something we should be focusing on as a community. And if a company came out tomorrow and said that they could lay track from here to Beaverton for $1 a foot, we would be silly not to jump on that, to Shelby's point, right? That there's some sort of technology potentially. I understand you didn't say that word for word, but the technology aspect of it, right? If there was something there that made that palatable and inexpensive and something we wanted to focus on, by us just directly saying at the upfront, we don't care We're not in favor of it. We don't want to pay for it. We don't even want to have a conversation with you. We hate it so much, we put it in our charter just to let you know what we think about beforehand. That's the part I have the issue with. So that's why I, wanted to address that again.
Thank you, Derek. And John, please.
Yeah, I think if we do a tax one, it needs to be very limited to just Tigard. Regional votes are regional votes. What happens in the region, what happens in the state, what happens federally, that's what happens there. So this would be, to me, something that just would increase a tax or a fee on only Tigard residents, not the region or not anybody else. So if Tigard
imposed by the city is really what
imposed by the city. In other words, if we had to kick in $10 million for our share, and then I feel the citizens should have a say and a vote in that. Okay, that's where I'll go on that. I feel if it's funded by the feds, if it's funded by Washington County, funded by regional tax, then everybody has a vote in that and everybody has a say. But if Tigard's going to kick in any money, I have no problem with leaving 52 part of it, like the first sentence or two. I don't like most of it, but I have no problem leaving that part in there. And that, Jeanette, I think something like that maybe is something we can hang our hat on and say, hey, we're recognizing that, you didn't want this. And so we're leaving something in there. So, but I also agree with Shelby is, putting something in that, what happens if it's an Uber fleet? Okay. And that's the new thing. And this just says we're not going to vote on something that deals with light rail. Well, what if it's not light rail? So the advantages of leaving this in, yes, maybe it's one of those antiquated things that 20 years from now, when they do the charter again, it gets thrown out. But in the short run, it's something we can hang our hat on that says, hey, we thought about it. We're not ignoring the 50% of the people that voted this way. All right, in fact, in this case, 70% of the people that voted this way.
Thank you, John. So I am not hearing anyone be in favor of keeping 52 and 53 as they currently stand, but hearing the same two recommendations, I think, that have been going around for a little while now, which is recommendation number 1, removing 52 and 53 in their entirety, and recommendation number 2, renewing 52 with a very limited imposed by the city clause rewrite, and removing 53, however, in its entirety. Is that in line with how folks are feeling? Great. So we're going to go ahead and do a vote on those two. There are 10 voting members here tonight, so 8 votes are required to pass anything. And then if something doesn't pass, then we'll continue our conversation. I'll go through our list. Let's see, and the names have been rearranged from the last time. Jason Snyder.
Oh, excuse me, Kim, could you repeat what we're voting on?
Yes, absolutely. So option number 1 is removing 52 and 53 in their entirety. Option number 2 is renewing 52 with limited imposed language that says that the tax would be imposed by Tigard, so it has a limited scope, and removing 53 in its entirety. Is that very clear to everybody?
And you had said rewrite 52.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Option 1, completely remove. Option 2, rewrite 52, remove 53. And then, so Jason.
Option 2.
And Margaret. And Derek.
Option 1, remove them both.
Karen.
Option 1.
And Zena.
I'm a non-voting member.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. I even have your name highlighted. Tony Simpson.
Option 2.
John Cook.
Option 2.
Jeanette. Sean.
Option 2.
And Lindsay Murphy.
Option 2.
Nathan Jackson.
2.
And Carol Krager.
Option 1.
So the way it currently stands, it is a 3-7 vote, 3 for option 1 and 7 for option 2. So at this point, we would not change anything in the charter. What I would suggest, and I would be open to hearing other options, is another vote voting option 2 against the current charter, but willing to hear other options. Jason, please.
I will just say that my preference is actually option 1. I'm guessing John Cook's preference is that too, but that's probably just not politically smart. So I just wanted to state it that way, because I do prefer option 1, and so I don't know if that causes anyone to rethink things a little bit, but I think many of us probably prefer option 1, but may realize the political reality of what may need to happen.
Thank you, Jason. And Margaret, please.
I can change my vote to option 2.
Okay, if you're comfortable with that.
Yes, I am.
Great, so with a vote of 8-2, option 2 passes. So Shelby has homework. She will be rewriting section 52 with some new language, and then we'll be recommending the removal of section 53.
So if I could just ask for clarification. So we had discussed, so there's taxes and fees. There's 2 different things. There were references made to adopting fees, and then the language was on taxes. So is there a consensus that this applies to taxes and fees, or is it just the levying of taxes?
My recommendation is both, because to me, if you're going to put in a $15 transportation fee to pay for light rail, then to me, you're doing the same thing.
Yeah,
and that $15 would be a monthly fee. So
based on the discussion, I think it would be a charge to community members related to transportation.
Not generically transportation.
Not, sorry, light rail. Light rail.
Okay.
Sorry, really put my foot in that one. All right, so we have 40 minutes left in our time together this evening, and we are very fortunate in that we have back-to-back meetings between this week and next. So I would like us to move into form of government, understanding that we will likely not finish that discussion this evening and that will carry over to next Monday. Does that sound good? Great. So we're going to start this conversation. I have a very brief presentation. I promise it's like 4 slides, mostly a little bit of your homework, just kind of talking through some things, an opportunity for folks to ask questions. And then we will move on to some Q&A if there are any questions. And then we'll be using breakout rooms so folks can have some really good discussion around this topic. Share my screen. All right, so this evening we'll discuss really an overview of the 2 primary forms of city government. And we're going to talk about some of the trends nationally when it comes to city government, and then some of the trends that are present in Oregon. So starting with mayor council, we always start with our community members who vote in and speak with and advocate to the mayor and the council. In the mayor council form of government, it more closely imitates our federal system, where the mayor acts as the executive branch and the council acts as a legislative branch. There are frequently checks and balances between the 2 and how they can execute power. The mayor will sometimes have veto power over council rules, but the mayor will then have powers over the department heads. So you can see this here. In this example, you have 4 department heads and the mayor's got those thick blue lines. They directly oversee the department heads. The council has these like dotted green lines. They generally have some form of oversight. So when I used to live in Washington, D.C. and worked for a city department there, we had to go to, while our department head was appointed by the mayor, we had to go to the council and do oversight hearings annually. So that is how that works. Like I said, very similar to the federal government. Around the turn of the 20th century, this form of government was there were some issues that folks were seeing, and there was some big reform movements that went through. You might have heard of like Tammany Hall. Basically, there was a lot of corruption that was happening in mayoral offices, or at least a lot of perceived corruption if there wasn't explicit, where there was a lot of favors being granted, with the political head of the government also being the executive head of the government. And so in that reform movement that started in early 1900s, and then the first council manager form of government was established in 1908 in Virginia. The first major city, Dayton, Ohio, adopted it in 1913. Very similar. You start with your community members and your voters, who create your governing body, which is your mayor and your council. In this form of government, your mayor is part of the council, and they set policy together. The mayor will often have some powers separate from the council that are laid out within the charter. For example, they will be the facilitator for city council meetings. I think in our charter and some others, the mayor appoints boards and commissions along the rules of council, or with the consent of council is generally the language, things like that. But they form a council body, and the mayor is a voting member of the council, often without any veto power, which is different than the mayor council form. In this form of government, the mayor and the council together will appoint/hire a city manager. The city manager is generally someone with a lot of professional experience managing city departments and governments. This is also a distinguishing feature between the two forms of government that's been generally well received, is that the city manager acts as kind of like your CEO of a company, and that's really where this form of government was adopted on. Where the previous one was based on the federal government, this was more adopted based on boards and corporations, where your governing body of your mayor and council form your board, and your city manager is your chief executive. In this form of government, the city manager directly oversees the department heads. Any questions or distinctions between based on those two forms of government? Okay, so nationally, both forms of government are very popular. They're widely used. There's a couple other forms that are used mostly in smaller cities, although Portland has its commission form of government, at least for 1.5 more years. But generally, when you look at cities that are about the size of Tigard, so somewhere between 25,000 to 100,000, because Tigard's in that kind of odd spot of about 55,000 people who live here, you have 63% of those size cities using a council manager form of government. And it really goes back to kind of those pros and cons. Smaller cities generally just don't have the resources necessarily to always hire a city manager, or don't have the complexity where they would need to hire a city manager. And then larger forms of government, or larger governments, larger cities with their forms of government will often have those really large mayoral offices. So you can kind of see how that really interesting breakdown happens. There are successful cities operating in both forms of government at all the sizes, just that this is how it typically breaks out. And then finally in Oregon, there are 241 cities in the state of Oregon. 30 have a population of over 20,000. So that's where I focused on, because I don't think anybody here wanted me reading 241 charters, but I was definitely willing to read 30. 29 of the 30 cities have the council manager form of government. The one exception is Portland, which will have a mayor council form. It's a little bit adapted because they are also hiring a chief executive officer, which is a recent adaptation that a lot of not a lot, but some larger cities are doing, to have both that city manager level in that government. The last city that I know of to change forms of government in Oregon was Beaverton. They were the last mayor council form until Portland recently adopted it, but they have recently adopted council manager in 2021. And then Tigard formally adopted our council manager form in 1996. Though based on the research and talking to people that Shelby and I have done, that seems to be more a codified change, whereas it had been a city manager form of government, or council manager form of government in the past. John, I bet you have some context.
Yeah, so Tigard, when they changed from to a council manager form of government, before was a council administrator form, which is a little different. If you look at a lot of smaller cities in Oregon, they don't actually hire a city manager sometimes they'll hire a part-time city administrator. And so in Tigard's change, it was to actually hire a full-time city manager versus having an administrator. So that was their term of doing that. So it really wasn't like they changed from mayor council form, they changed from council administrator form to council manager form.
Thank you. We were trying to figure that out. Appreciate that. So those are the breakdowns between these two forms of government. So the question before you this evening and going into next week is going to be, is the council manager form of government still the appropriate form of government for Tigard? And if not, how would you like to adapt it? And Zena, please.
So my question is it like always the council members are 4 in number, or is it something?
No. And actually, so this is one of our future meeting guide topics, is discussing specifically the number of counselors that would be in that governing body. Tigard is actually very unusual for having 4. Most cities in Oregon have 6. But that is a great question and a future topic. Okay, so there are no questions. I have our breakout rooms ready, so I'm going to send everybody to your rooms. We'll start those conversations right away. And so you'll be in there for, say, 15 minutes. Nominate someone to give kind of a breakdown of what your group's conversation has been when we come back. And we'll see you all soon.
That breakout thing room worked. It worked technically. Yay.
So much better than on Teams.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Don't have people over
Yes.
other conversations.
Yes. Can you convince the other committees to go on Zoom, please?
We do that very, so we had Karen from our room, and then Jesse. Who was your, Jesse? Not, oh, there.
Jeanette.
I was the other one, Kim.
Oh, great. So whichever one of you would like to report out first.
We were group one, I'll go. Yeah, well, we had Jason, so we were definitely talking about the role of the mayor a lot. But pointing out the size of our city definitely makes a difference on what we can do and what we can't do just because of our finances and the number of people. We like the idea of having a professional doing the work because of the size and the complexity of the issues. We did go into a conversation about like who is really in charge from the public perception, and also the counselors feeling like who's really in charge. Do they feel like they're rubber stamping things sometimes? And the accountability issue of that the staff aren't elected, and so the public is viewing the elected officials to really be doing the work and being accountable for everything. A little bit of talk about who can be removed, that the public can remove the council and the mayor, but the council is the one who can remove the city manager. Accountability, yeah, but who's elected. And then the last thing was that the council members sit on various committees to do the deep learning with the staff that that is required in these complex issues, and they report back to the council as a group, and the counselors are relying on each other to do the deep learning on different issues because it's just too much for everybody to learn everything. So we like the current form of council manager.
Thank you, Karen. I would add that we also had some discussion around friction that can occur between the mayor and council and staff at times that can become a cultural issue, and how that could be resolved. And then Jeanette, please.
Great, thank you. Well, we are fortunate to have the other former mayor in our room. So Don had joined us, and overwhelmingly it was for the council manager form of government, I think for a few different reasons. One, the equity aspect that you don't have to be a professional mayor, nearly anyone could run for mayor. The fact that there's professional staff that are trained, whether it's in labor negotiations or in transportation expertise. So that's something that mayor wouldn't be able to, or wouldn't have that diverse of experience across a whole city. There's also continuity with the council manager form of government, as well as a longer term view versus a short term view. And we did not get into friction. And we had a couple other suggestions, which I know we'll probably raise at the next meeting where we continue this discussion. So thank you, Kim.
Great, thank you. All right, so going into next week, we will continue specifically this conversation and probably send out some more materials around the following conversation, which is going to be on mayoral powers. So I know we sent out that monster meeting guide with just like, these are all of the topics and discussion questions for the next 4 or 5 meetings. Were there any kind of concerns or questions about that as we kind of start tackling that work? Okay, look forward to probably some more resources and references as we go along. And then just to share our schedule and where we're at. So actually, I want to go back one slide before here. So at the beginning, we shared this framework that we were going through. We were starting with these straightforward concepts, moving into these complex policy discussions, and then into these intricate ones. I just really want to commend everybody for moving completely through all of these straightforward and complex. We've done so much work together in the last 2.5 months. And we're 5 meetings into our planned 12 meetings, and we're going to spend that rest of the time on these really intricate discussions around Tigard government. So you can all pat yourselves on the back tonight. And so moving forward, we finished our high capacity transit. So next week we'll do form of government and elected officials. And then we have at least the next 2 meetings planned to continue to discuss elected officials. So that's the monster meeting guide will cover those meetings. And the elections process. So we've got at least the next 4 going into that meeting guide. And then we're going to talk about city officers, and then fees and preamble in June, and then finish our work together. This schedule is still very much in flux as we're going along. So if you have other thoughts or considerations, happy to take those as they come to you.
I tell you, one thing I appreciate is that the amount of material that you do send us. You know, it is a lot, but I think it gives us some good background to be able to be prepared to answer the questions that are listed in the agenda. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, happy to do that, Margaret. Thank you. And John, please.
Yeah, I've had something that I wanted to bring up from the very beginning, but I really don't want to wait till June 26th to do it and all of a sudden sort of spring it on everybody. And that relates to, and I know we're not going to answer this tonight, but I know that when the council put this committee together, they had some outlines that they wanted. One of those outlines I think I still would like to discuss, and I know the council still has full capacity. They get to decide what they want to do. I get that. But the way this is planned is to go for a November election. When you were talking earlier, we were talking votes, and you were saying, well, look, that was a March election. Look at the small number of votes. If we move this to a November election, November is good in even numbered years, but this is an odd numbered year. So I don't know of anything else that's on this November's election. And so my worry is that it will be just a very small election that won't have a lot of people at it. So from that standpoint, I understand the timing wise is let's get it all figured out so that for next November's election, we can figure out what's going on with our city council and if we're going to add more councilors, if we're changing form of government or get that. But at the same time, I think having a May election, which is a primary for the president, you know, everything else, or, you know, governor, there's just so many things going on in May that it would cause it to be a large election. And I think we'd get a lot more voters and it would come into play. It would be tight, but you still could make changes in time for the June signups for city council. So it makes it a tight schedule, but it still is doable in my mind. So I know the council has say on all of that. I just thought I'd throw it out to everybody else so that everybody else had a recommendation that sees where I'm coming from on that.
Thank you for raising that. We do have 4 minutes left in our meeting tonight, so we are not going to open that up for discussion, but it is an ongoing conversation with staff, and thank you for bringing that up. Let's see, I think, Carol, did you raise your hand in response to John or separately?
Oh, I thought that, no, in response, I thought it made a lot of sense as the city's election official to go for a even year, May, and we do have time to get it set for November. Changes are made.
We'll continue that later. And then Derek, please.
Just a comment. While I have no interest in relitigating the entire transportation issue, I would ask, one of the things that Shelby brought up beforehand was we should all look at this through the parameters of whether or not something should be included within the charter. So the way that we left that is that we've basically left within the charter, while we don't necessarily oppose mass transit, we are going to leave some semblance of the former piece in there that talks about raising taxes. I would ask if it's possible for us to revisit it, not due to the transportation issue, but more taxes in general. If we're going to go that route where we're going to make it so that we want to prohibit a certain type of fee or tariff or tax increase, wouldn't we want to approach that as a general rule for all things? To John's point, talking about parks and water and other sorts of stuff that get snuck in on different bills, wouldn't we want to do that to make it more inclusive rather than just one specific issue?
Yes, and that is the topic for June 12th. That is where that I can change that to taxes and fees, but you had brought that up a couple meetings ago. And so we've added that, and we have staff preparing some backup material for that as well.
So are we lumping that in with that, or are we going to have a separate section that says taxes and fees, also mass transit?
We'll discuss taxes and fees all together. This group did come to a recommendation for tonight, so we could revisit it again if it's in contradiction to the discussion that happens that evening, but for now, it's probably just going to stand. Thank you, Derek. And Jason, please.
I just want to make sure I'm clear. You know, we had our breakout group report out, so I assume we're gonna, this is a question, are we gonna start our next meeting with a continued discussion of that?
Oh, absolutely. No decisions around form of government were made tonight.
Right, no, I understand no decisions were made, but you know, we kind of just blurted out some report outs, and I guess I just want to make sure that I'm clear in my head, we're coming back to that to begin sort of more of a discussion about that.
Yes, we are going back for a discussion.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, it is 7:30. Everybody have a great night.